Okay, we'll get proceedings underway. Thank you for joining us today for the webinar, Wild Dog Control. My name's Ian McFarland and I'm one of the Sheep Connect SA team. So today's webinar has been recorded and we'll upload that recording to the Sheep Connect SA YouTube channel in coming days. So we welcome you to revisit the webinar yourself and share it with colleagues. Tonight's webinar is brought to you by Sheep Connect SA, and Sheep Connect SA is supported by Australian Wool Innovation and the SA Sheep Industry Fund. For more information on the program, you can visit the website or follow us on Twitter, and all our webinars are uploaded to the Sheep Connect SA YouTube channel. So tonight's presenter is Heather Miller. Heather is a State Wild Dog Planning Coordinator. Heather has worked on a sheep and cattle property in the pastoral districts for 12 years. She also worked for the SA Arid Lands NRM board for about 6 years. And during this time, she had wide experience in helping land managers coordinate wild dog control, did some research into the impacts of 1080, and she's also been involved in drafting wild dog management plans for the NRM boards. And I must say that photo is not of Heather, it's one of her colleagues. So at this time, I'll hand over to Heather to start today's presentation. Well, yours, Heather.
Thank you. Thanks, Ian. Thanks for the intro. Yeah, welcome everyone. I'm interested to be having a chat with you guys tonight. Would love to have some questions, just any questions at all that you have as I go through the presentation. I'm happy to share my knowledge, and no doubt there's some things that I won't know that you might ask me, but I'll see what I can do to answer whatever questions come up. So as Ian said, I have spent a bit of time with the management of wild dogs. I've lived on pastoral properties and seen the damage dogs can do both to sheep and cattle. The research project that we did was outside the dog fence, and it was looking at the effects of 1080, whether or not that had an effect on stock loss, and also whether or not it affected biodiversity. And that research project was over 6 years, and we did, collect scats, did activity surveys, spent a lot of time out in the pastoral country, in the cattle country. So just a quick little background on the legislation around wild dogs. In South Australia, the wild dogs inside the fence are a declared pest under the Landscapes SA Act. From there, it flows on into the SA Wild Dog Policy, which is currently under review. The wild dog policy is being reviewed, as is the SA Wild Dog Strategic Plan. The strategic plan is overseen by the SA Wild Dog Advisory Group, a group that provides direct advice through to the Minister. So, as I said, the dogs declared for destruction inside the dog fence under the Landscapes SA Act. So that means any landholders inside the fence are required to destroy wild dogs no matter what the tenure. So it could be a conservation park or a national park, Aboriginal owned lands, livestock producers, sheep or cattle, a mining company's own land as well. If they have wild dogs on their properties, then they are obligated to destroy them. Outside the fence, the dog is neither declared nor is it protected, and that comes under the National Parks Act. So at the moment, the wild dog policy is under review and out for public consultation. Ultimately, inside the fence, we have aspirations. Once we can stop dogs coming through the fence, we have aspirations of eradication, and we know that's a big word, but we have to aspire to something, and that's a good start for us. And also, the SA Wild Dog Strategic Plan aligns with the National Wild Dog Action Plan. From there, generally, the districts and at a regional level, they have their own wild dog management plans, and then some districts even can go so far as having from their regional plan, then they do get groups of landholders together, and those landholders then work on a plan themselves of what they're going to do to control dogs in their smaller patch rather than district wide. But they form local action groups. Not all regions have wild dog problems to the extent where they need to form smaller groups, but certainly that the case in the SA Arid Lands and Also, there's a few groups starting to form in northern New York and even over in the far west coast, the EP area. So just a little bit about the wild dog policy that's currently under review. We've taken it to all of the NRM boards and the SA Wild Dog Advisory Group. That took about 6 months last year, I suppose, and it eventually has now gone out for public consultation. In this policy, there are a few changes from the previous policy. One of them is that there is going to be some baiting standards according to different regions, and the state, or inside the dog fence, the state has been divided into 5 regions with a different standard of baiting measures for each region, depending on the amount of dog activity that's in those regions. Another thing that this policy has as a change is that they're wanting to declare the wild dog for control in the buffer zone. And if you can see on the map, you can see the dog fence. It's the black line that sort of runs from one side of the state to the other. And then there's a bit of a pinky coloured line shaded running the full length of the fence. That buffer zone is an imaginary line. There's not another fence that 35 kilometres out. But what we're wanting to do is to declare the dog for control in that buffer zone to help ease the pressure on the fence, and in particular if there was any damage to the fence. If there weren't so many dogs immediately in that buffer zone, well then not so many would come through if there happened to be a breach. So that's another thing, a change in this policy that's out for review. Also too, there's a proposal to allow aerial baiting throughout South Australia. So currently aerial baiting is only allowed in the SA arid lands region, which generally is that mustardy colour on your map, although some of that is EP in the far west coast and a little bit of it is SA Murray-Darling Basin, just east of Jamestown. So the aerial baiting is currently only in that SA arid lands region, so the proposal is to allow aerial baiting throughout South Australia. That doesn't necessarily mean that aerial baiting will take place. There's lots of rules and regulations around 1080 baiting and where it can be done and that sort of thing. So it just opens up the opportunity for bigger patches of inaccessible country to be able to be baited by the air where you can't get to it on the ground. It doesn't mean that the whole area outside the fence is going to be aerial baited. There's thoughts that the buffer zone could be aerial baited if necessary, especially if there was some damage done to the fence, say a flood came through, high rainfall, took out part of the fence and patrolmen can't get along the fence to repair it. Well then, if aerial baiting was allowed across South Australia, we would be able to aerial bait that portion in the buffer zone to limit the amount of dogs that then come down into the sheep country. Very little control happens in the whole area of that map that's shaded green. A lot of that is Aboriginal lands and national parks or conservation parks. So as I said, this policy is currently out for public consultation. You can go onto the Your Say website and have a look at it. There'll be a copy of the new policy. You can provide comment either on the Your Say website, or else you can provide comment direct to the email address that's at the bottom of this page.
Heather, we have a question. Who sits on the Wild Dog Advisory Group, and do members represent all stakeholders?
Yes, they do represent all stakeholders. We have representatives from the Dog Fence, Livestock SA, the South Australian Sheep Advisory Group, PIRSA, the Aboriginal Reconciliation Unit of Department of Environment, National Parks representation, and there's representation from 4 NRM boards or landscape boards. They're the ones that are affected by wild dogs, so that's the SA Arid Lands, Eyre Peninsula, Northern New York and SA Murray-Darling Basin. And we also have a rep from the Box Flat Dingo Control Coordinating Committee from down the southeast, and the Conservation Council have representation as well. So I think I've rattled off them all. Generally, I would consider that all of the stakeholders are represented on that Wild Dog Advisory Group.
Thanks, Heather. Another one's come in. How will organically certified properties in the buffer zone get around limitations to using 1080 or aerial or ground baiting?
So the organic certifying companies have provided the organic properties the option of excising a small portion of their land or portions of their land out where cattle, because all those guys in that country are cattle producers, excising out portions of their property so that cattle can't get to an area where they could put bait. So, for example, they might put a fence around, if they haven't got a fence already around a dam. If there was already a fence around a dam, well, all the landholders need to do is they need to develop a management plan with the areas marked out that they have excised out so that baits can be put in those areas. And then that approval is given by the organic certifier for them to be able to bait, because the livestock aren't able to get into where the 1080 baits are. The aerial baiting wouldn't be able to target those excised areas. So it is unlikely that aerial baiting would take place in areas where there's organic properties for controlling that buffer zone, but it might be something that there is an extra effort, if the fence does go down, that there's extra effort on that property where the fence is, that's organic, that baiting takes place around their watering points where that have been excised out of organic production. Okay, if there's no more questions, I'll move on to the dog fence. I'm sure that most people have heard the dog fence is going to be replaced over the next 4 to 5 years, or 1,600 kilometres of it in South Australia. The total cost will be around 25 million, with 10 million coming from the federal government, 10 from state government and 5 million from industry. On the map that you can see there, the red lines are the areas that are proposed to be rebuilt. Currently, there was quite an extensive process for the tenders for both the materials and for the building of the fence. That process has been gone through and it's currently sitting for approval with the minister. The process that the Dog Fence Rebuild Committee went through was extensive, with their consultation with the 5 local dog fence boards, as well as most of those boards have local landholders and pastoralists on their board. So they had a lot of input into the materials, what the construction will be like, all of that sort of thing. And also a lot of the pastoralists had input as well into the rebuild. So they're hoping that they will start the rebuild in autumn this year. So anytime from now through till the end of May. The tenders haven't been approved by the minister as yet, but it's very close for that to be happening.
A couple more questions, probably relating more to the last slide. What is the rationale for the 35k buffer zone, and what information fed into this decision?
So the 35k buffer zone has been around since the early 90s. The decision around that was based on the home range of the wild dog and the dispersal distance. So dogs can travel a long way. They also have, if they've set up a home range, they also have a home range of about 25 square k's. So the buffer zone was decided with that 35 kilometre zone around that piece of information and that data that's gathered over the years. So it was determined back in the early 90s.
Thanks, Heather. And the next one was, who is responsible to bait in the buffer zone, and will that change under the proposed policy changes?
So the Dog Fence Board at the moment they're responsible for controlling within the vicinity of the fence. With the proposed changes, the land managers will be expected to control in that buffer zone. So the owners of the land that have the buffer zone in their property will be the ones that are expected to control. They used to do control back, I don't know, would be around 20 years ago, I suppose, where they baited around each of their watering points. It might be more than 20 years, but around that time, and the landholders, whatever watering points they had within that buffer zone, they baited around those watering points, and there were management plans written up for each of the properties. But that has generally gone by the wayside with the properties that, not all properties, but some of the properties that have become organic in that time no longer undertake any control. Mind you, there are some properties in the buffer zone who do control wild dogs because they have excised out areas on their place, and they bait those areas and they still retain their organic status. A quick one through the wild dog evolution. The dingo comes down through the wolf breed and was brought to Australia about 3,500 years ago. So it was, introduced many, many years ago. Over the years, the dingoes have hybridised with domestic dogs. So there's quite a variety of purity throughout Australia, and you can see that on the map. Over on the east coast, that's a very low purity of dingo with very high hybridisation. In South Australia, I know that outside the fence, one lot of data that was submitted for this particular map, one of the dogs was 96% pure, but then down inside the fence, down in the Flinders Ranges, the purity was getting, as low as 50%. So generally with hybridisation, some of the dogs in particular areas are getting to be larger dogs, and also the females can start breeding at around 9 months of age. They generally, some people think that if there's hybridisation, they're breeding with domestic dogs, well then they can have 2 litters of pups a year. That's not generally the case, because the bitches that are domestic can have 2 litters of pups, because we take the pups away from them at 6 weeks of age, and then the bitch gets back, gets her body back to normal and comes back on heat again relatively quickly, so that they can actually have 2 litters of pups within 12 months. But with wild dogs, they have their pups with them until they're 3 months old, and they're very dependent on them in the first couple of months, and then the mums and dads are teaching them to hunt for the next couple of months, and then they're independent after that. So it would be very, very difficult for a wild dog to have 2 litters of pups in 1 year, because they wean their pups when they're a lot older, not at 6 weeks, but at around 3 months. This is just a map to give you some idea of what wild dogs can do and the distances and things that they can travel. There was some collaring done of dogs over in New South Wales. This particular dog, the collar stayed, so they trapped the dog, put a collar on it, and then set it free. And it ended up travelling 530 kilometres over a 6-month period. And the dots on the maps are the GPS locations of where it travelled in that time. So they can travel a vast distance. I know, it's not that far really from the dog fence, say, to, if you were thinking about the Renmark area, 350 odd Ks. So when you can see that dogs can travel that far. Also too, with this dog, there was a landholder that saw the map and saw it was zoomed in closer, so the landholder could see that the dog had actually passed through his property, and he didn't even know that it had gone through. So it just shows that there can be dogs passing through your country, but you don't see the tracks. They might stick out of sight. They may not travel on a road, so you don't actually see any evidence of them, but they can quite easily move from one property to another without people knowing that they actually have had dogs on their place. We collared a dog in South Australia up in the northeast corner, and that one went 600 kilometres over into Queensland and ended up back on the property. It did a big ring route over a few months. So a little bit on the breeding seasons. Around this time, dogs are starting to move, and that's really evident out in the arid lands. We're getting landholders telling us now that there's more activity now than they had over, since all over the summer months. So from December through until now, they're starting to see a lot more movement. So they mate from April to June, and that's where you see a lot of activity on the road. They tend to use the roads to get quickly from one place to another looking for a mate. Their gestation period's about 63 days, and as you can see in the photograph on the right, they can have, somewhere anywhere between 1 and 10 pups. And that bitch there that was shot, she had 8 pups. So it doesn't take long. If the season is favourable and she had the 8 pups, well, often they will have the pups, but they may not all survive if the season isn't good. But if the season's favourable, it doesn't take long for one bitch to have 8 pups. You only need 5 bitches to have 8 pups, and you've got 40 dogs on the ground. So they can, in good seasons, breed up very quickly. The pups are usually born between July and September. As I said, they're still with the parents by the time they're about 3 months old, and the parents take them out hunting. So they do a lot of teaching in that time. It's at times like that, when you tend to see more damage just for fun rather than actually for a feed. Dogs love a good chase, and if something's going to move, well, then they'll chase it and can do a lot of damage. They may not kill the livestock, but they can certainly do some damage where the sheep have to be destroyed. Or also with cattle, they certainly do enough damage to the ears and tails, and that I'll show a slide of that in a moment. When they're out hunting, through October through to December, they generally are with their parents and being taught. But sometime in January to March, they head off and have to make their own way in the big wide world, and that's when they have to fend for themselves and getting their own food because their parents are heading off and going back into the mating season again. So the bottom photograph is of some scratchings and mark-ups. That is a sign that there's a dog around the place. They're marking the territory. So that's a pretty easy one to see in the sand. These breeding seasons actually really determine the timing of proactive control. So the time when the dogs are mating between April and June, which is now, that's a good time because there's a lot of activity. It's a good time to be doing control because you're seeing a lot of activity, seeing a lot of dogs. And the other time is when the pups are out and about. So between October and December, they're out and about with mum and dad, and so there's a lot of activity then as well. So that's another good time. Generally, the other 2 times that landholders undertake their control is once in autumn and once in spring. So this is just a quick slide I put together of how big is the problem. This is over the last 18 months. In the SA Arid Lands region, there would be over 1,000 dogs have been shot and trapped. These are the ones that we know of. There's a lot of information out there that we don't necessarily get to hear or see. We're not provided with the information. People just do their dog control, shoot or trap, and it doesn't necessarily get shared. So, but the other figures that I've got are generally, because they're smaller numbers, they're generally fairly well not far off the mark. So west of Penong over the last 18 months has probably been around 31 dogs. The Whyalla Port Augusta Quorn area, 20, but I've got a feeling it could even be more than that, 20. Orroroo Jamestown, 10. Burra and Robertstown area, 20. Waikerie Renmark, 1. And down the southeast in the Narcat region, or the Box Flat region, around 4. So as you can see from the map that I had up of the distance that dogs can travel, if there's been over 1,000 dogs shot and trapped up in the arid lands, it won't take that long for dogs, once they start dispersing, to move down into, further south into the agricultural country. I could be telling people how to suck eggs here. You probably know what to look for with dogs, if there were dogs around. And the obvious thing is the damage to the livestock. Calves with ears torn, calves without tails, or sheep. Sometimes the sheep you don't really see damage until shearing. I know a number of landholders will see a lot of damage once they bring the sheep into the shed and they see bite marks and things. The calves up in that top left corner, there was a number of them that had been damaged at this one watering point that I went to, and there was a couple of dogs feeding on a calf, and then there were about 3 others that had just been, chased around, rolled in the mud, and had quite a bit of damage to them. Also, the sort of things that you can look for is if the change in distribution of emus and roos. Also, I know of properties that have had a mob of sheep in the yards, and dogs have come in overnight and broken the yards and that down. Also, unusual livestock behaviour, flighty stock that are in unusual locations or pushed into corners of paddocks. One thing that is telling too is your own dogs. If you've got your own dogs out and they're behaving differently, sniffing and marking up areas and that sort of thing, that usually can tell that there's been a dog around that that they're not familiar with. And also, obviously, the scats and tracks and any markups that you might see. Different control options that we have open to us. We have fresh meat baits. That can be any form of meat. They need to be injected with 1080, and it's usually the NRM staff that go around and inject the fresh meat. There can be roux hearts, can be whatever meat you can get your hands on. There's a little bit of a shortage of meat at the moment for fresh meat baits. So I've been told the manufactured baits can come as dog on, or that's like a little bait that is a bit like a mud cake square. The other one is a DK9. That's like a little Frankfurt that's been dried. Both of those are manufactured, and they contain either 1080, that one poison, or another poison called PAP. The canid pest ejectors, which is the little one in the middle, that's something that can be anchored in the ground, and the dogs need to pull on it. The lure is on top, as you can see in that picture. So that's the bait head is on top. The dogs will pull on it and it shoots the poison up into the dog's mouth. So they don't actually eat the lure head. Usually that's a dried lure on top, but the mechanism is like a trigger mechanism, and it sprays the 1080 that's in a capsule up into the dog's mouth. You can also use leg hold trapping, rubber jaw traps. In South Australia, we have to put strychnine on traps that comes under the Animal Welfare Act, that strychnine must be put on traps if you're using leg hold traps. Obviously, shooting, the exclusion fencing, there's a lot of that going on in Queensland, and guardian animals with maremmas and alpacas, that type of thing. With the maremmas, I do know that some maremmas, if they're not trained properly and if they're not looked after properly by the landholders, they have gone wild and end up being a wild dog themselves. So maremmas are something that needs to be trained well from a good breeder. So what are the other regions doing to try to get on top of the problem? So like I said, there's the 4 regions. They do a coordinated landscape scale control, and they utilise all the tools that they've got in their toolbox: baiting, trapping, shooting. There's a few that use guardian animals, and maybe there's some further south that use fencing, but I'm not sure of any. With the coordinated control, it's good for the landholders to decide on the properties that they're going to work with. So usually a group of neighbours all get together and do all the control at the same time, so that they are controlling across the landscape, not just one property doing something 1 month and then 3 months later another property doing it. They are all working together to do the control at the same time. The NRM officers are integral in helping pull those groups together, having the land managers providing the service, the injection service, or providing education and training around the canid pest ejectors, or how to bait, where to bait, all of that sort of thing. Often with the groups, it's good if there's one contact person or a leader within the group that can do do some of the organising, ringing around just to get people together, so that everybody is coordinating their control at the same time. So the other things that are happening out in the regions, besides the coordination and the landscape scale baiting, is the aerial baiting in the SA arid lands. That's undertaken once a year, and it's going again this year I think it's toward the end of April. AWI and the Sheep Industry fund the aerial baiting, and it's primarily for inaccessible areas. So it's not in areas where landholders can drive their vehicle and put out baits themselves. It might be in sandhill country where there are no roads, around lakes or along the edges of lakes. It could be on along ridges in the hills, that sort of thing. So that's very specific for inaccessible areas. This year, the Arid Land region are going to do the aerial baiting. They'll drop around 50,000 baits over 90 properties. Also, too, there's the trapping service that is funded through industry and state government. The current government made a commitment that they would provide $300,000 a year for a trapping program. There are 5 part-time trappers working. They can work throughout the state. Their biggest job is in the Arid Lands region at the moment, but they have also trapped over on the far west coast and in around the Peterborough area. So if people are having problems with dogs or have seen dogs and have had livestock loss and they've also baited, well, then they can have access to the funded trapping program. So far, in the 18 months since that program began, the trappers have trapped 483 dogs across 48 properties. Part of what they do is they also undertake a bit of training. So if the landholder has a spare couple of hours, they generally will go with them and be upskilled a bit themselves in learning how to trap and how to find and dog activity and where to set traps and that sort of thing. There's another tool that can be used and it is used relatively extensively in the arid lands, but there are certainly other people further south that are using it too, and it's called Wild Dog Scan. It's an app that you can download or have on your phone. It's an app that if you see a wild dog sighting or any tracks or scats or anything like that, you can record it, or if you've seen dog damage or seen a dog, or even if you've controlled a dog yourself, you can record it, and it goes onto a map. What this does is it helps us see how big the dog problem is. If you look on the left-hand side of your screen, you can see a picture of the homepage, and you can see where you can record a sighting, damage, or record control. If you go now and look at the picture that's in the middle of the page, the date that it's observed automatically comes up, and your location automatically comes up as well, a GPS location. So with the wild dog sighting, there's a few things you can put in. You don't have to enter it all, but you can put in your property name if you want to, and the number that you've seen. Just below that is wild dog control. So the control techniques that are used, you can also put in. So it might be that you're ground baited, you've trapped using foothold traps, shot, cane and pest ejector, and on it goes. You can attach a photograph to it if you want to. And also you can record any damage. You can record whether or not it's killed or mauled sheep or lambs, goats, cattle. The important thing is it gives the GPS location and the date. And what it does is you can actually do that as an individual, but if there are a number of people that are neighbours, you can actually form a group. And then when that group is formed and you're all using Wild Dog Scan, you can, if you want to, get a notification if a neighbour has seen a dog on their place, and it can be an immediate notification. So it actually helps with communication of where the dogs are in the area. If you don't have mobile phone reception, that's okay. You can still use your phone and record the data, and when you get home, it will upload once you've linked into your Wi-Fi. So this is what Wild Dog Scan looks like once recordings and things have been done. I can't remember that picture, what period of time that was taken over, but looking at it, it was probably a 12-month period where people have uploaded their data from across South Australia. It's not only, you can see Australia-wide what's going on in the dog world. That's it from me. I hope you found it interesting. I'm available anytime. My phone number's down there at the bottom, and you can email me anytime as well if you'd like any further information.
So just a question regards the app. Who's collecting and monitoring the information?
There's 3 of us statewide that receive the information. The fellow that designed the app works for the Centre for Invasive Species Solutions. He's based over in New South Wales. He receives information Australia-wide, and then myself and another fellow, Marty Bauer, receives the information South Australia-wide. And then, depending on what region you live in and how the group is set up, will then the NRM officer that's relevant to your district and your region, they can receive the information as well.
Okay, thank you. And then there was a question around the distance dogs travel. Are they travelling for a feed source, or are they just on a holiday?
They're probably on the lookout for a mate. Sometimes with dogs that are trapped, they probably think, well, I'm not going to hang around here if this is what's going to happen to me, and then they just shoot through and just keep trotting. They cover a big distance just through trotting. So often they do the travel because they're looking for a mate. So there's no one around in the district where they were born and brought up, and when they become independent, they've got to go and find their own patch. So they just keep on keeping on until they find a partner and set up home with them.
Right. All right. Well, I'd just like to thank you, Heather, for sharing your insight. If anyone's got any additional questions, you can contact us directly using the information on your webinar registration. And thank you again for your time tonight, and have a wonderful evening.
That's my pleasure. Thank you. I hope it was informative for the people on the other end too.
All right. Thank you, everybody.